Gresham College presents The Universities, Over-Regulation by Baroness Deech of Cumnor, DBE.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the first of my 6 Gresham lectures this calendar year. I've called the series Regulation, Regulation, Regulation. And there are a couple of themes running through them. One of which is whether we have not replaced trustworthiness by regulation, indeed over-regulation. And the more we regulate, the less we have trust in whatever it is we're regulating. And then you ask yourself, do we trust the regulators? And so it goes on. I'm starting with the universities. There are about 1.4 million students in this country, so not an insignificant constituency. And these are the people who have decided their fate in recent times. Anthony Crossland, behind the abolition of comprehensives, Highgate School and Trinity Oxford. Shirley Williams, St Paul's Girls' School and Somerville, Oxford. Margaret Thatcher, Grammar School and Somerville, Oxford. Sir Richard Lambert, who headed up a committee, Fettes and Balliol. Lord Deering, Grammar School and Hull. Tony Blair, Fettes and Oxford. Lord Brown, author of the most recent report about fees and so on, King's School, Ely, St John's, Cambridge. David Cameron, as everyone knows, Eton and Brasenose. Vince Cable and Nick Clegg, Grammar School in Vince Cable's case and Cambridge, Nick Clegg, Westminster and Cambridge. Professor Les Ebden, the new head of Offa, Grammar School and Imperial College. David Willits, King Edward's, Birmingham and Christ Church, Oxford. The relevance of their background will become clear. In order to regulate, one has to know the purpose of the institutions being regulated. So I start with some definitions of higher education. Older ones have much in common. More recent ones show a distinct shift. I am also speaking of the interrelation of independence and the quality of institutions and how they're regulated, which is another theme running through all 6 of my lectures this year. Many hands have attempted to define higher education, and I can do no better than start with Newman, the idea of a university, talking about the purpose of a university. His assertions had a different aim from mine. He was pleading for intellectual education as a force in its own right, distinct from moral and spiritual indoctrination. But he warned about preserving the difference between information, namely the passive reception of facts, and education, the enlargement, comparison, and advancement of what men, as he said, knew, a distinction even more important to elaborate in our times. He stressed the need to educate oneself, to evaluate and judge in order for the mind to come to a decision. This is especially important in an age when the indiscriminate collection of information on the internet is common. There has been reported this month the result of a survey of 1,200 Oxford University students and staff on the idea of a university. 98% of them agreed that universities exist to add to the sum of knowledge in the world. 93% that they added to the sophistication of human thought, and 86% that they exist to equip people to change society. Very few of the respondents saw themselves as consumers or saw education as a consumer good. Those who did see themselves as consumers were less likely than average to be looking for a good life, for truth, wisdom, virtue, or beauty. They were less likely to see themselves as acquiring knowledge or skills for their own sake, to be doing something they loved, or to see themselves as being formed by education. The consumer group were less likely to see university education as a privilege, a pleasure, or a social, moral, or personal good, unlike the teachers and postgrads who responded to the survey. The full results of the survey will be online shortly at www.ousu, that's Oxford University Student Union.org. The differences between education on the one hand and training on the other, between knowledge and skills, should be made clear as a base of any policy discussion. Universities ought not, in my view, to be exclusively or primarily concerned with immediately applicable knowledge. Their task is, in my view, the assembling, transmission, and development of a common body of knowledge, the fostering of intelligence, intelligibility, and independence of mind in students for the common good. They are therefore the proper concern of the government of a democratic state in its allocation of resources. Too heavy a reliance by universities on support from industry or the professions, and the pressures likely to be imposed by them as employers, for example, instant applicability, value for money, controlled publication of research, may be even more damaging to the task of higher education than government controls and accountability in a well-intentioned democratic system. For example, lasers and penicillin were both the results of pure research. Whether competition has a proper place in this pursuit is as complex a question as it is in the National Health Service, another public facility where the value of competition is being debated right now. Education, in my view, is not simply a matter of imparting information, inculcating skills, and training the individual to make autonomous choices. It is not simply a matter of preparing the right number of candidates with the skills currently required for business. Education is also a matter of inducting successive generations into the society in which they will be participants. Education is preparation for citizenship and for many and varied forms of employment and leadership in society. It should impart ambition, motivation for living, ability to savour work and leisure, independence of thought, an appreciation of politics, the feeling of a stake in the future, and control over one's destiny. These qualities ought to be valued by any government which aims to achieve the preservation of high-quality higher education for as many as possible. And of course, at the same time, it has to enable each generation not only to be educated, but to climb onto the shoulders of the previous generation and make advances in science, technology, medicine, economics, and the critical analyses that underpin our advanced, democratic, globalized society. Why does independence of higher education matter? Professor Zellick said in his Atkin lecture in the year 2000 that the independence of universities is important because no other institution in society, and certainly not the internet, has the responsibility for preserving, advancing, and communicating knowledge. There will be no development of national political policies or of any other institution unless the universities establish and keep the right of being exemplars of fearless criticism. The need for integrity in climate change research is a good example for the need for trust in what the universities do. Limitations on the autonomy of universities impact adversely on the academic freedom of individual academics too, as exemplified by the Blue Skies research I mentioned above, although this does not rule out the need for accountability mechanisms for the spending of public money. Lord Jenkins, of blessed memory, secured the insertion of a definition of academic freedom in one of the most repressive, otherwise repressive, pieces of legislation, the Education Reform Act 1988. In section 202, subsection 2, which was ending tenure, he got inserted, I quote, to ensure that academic staff have freedom within the law to question and test received wisdom and to put forward new ideas and controversial or unpopular opinions without placing themselves in jeopardy of losing their jobs or privileges they may have at their individual institutions. Though no doubt any expression of criticism of government policy will keep them from quangos and vice-chancellorships. University education is for the public good, regardless of who pays for it, and ought not to be put to gain political advantages. Let me also scotch the notion right away that university education only benefits those who receive it, and therefore only they should pay for it. The entire population benefits from the services of doctors, scientists, architects, broadcasters, authors, and all the other professions that graduates may enter. Indeed, the children of the woman graduate themselves benefit from her care, even if she's not at outside work. It is dangerous for students to see higher education largely as a stepping stone to a more lucrative career, or for academics to lose interest in teaching because only research counts in the allocation of resources. The way higher education is regarded has, however, changed at the hands of the distinguished alumni of top universities, grammar and independent schools, whom I listed at the start of this lecture. According to Sir Ivor Crewe, in The Role of Universities in the 21st Century, a publication, they are now expected to create apparently useful knowledge and transfer it to business, provide professional training for almost all the public services, help local schools to raise their standards and ambitions, promote social mobility by widening participation. This is a distortion of the way higher education is seen in almost all other Western countries. Every time there is a need to review universities or inject an extra element into their governance, a businessman, sometimes with a less than perfect record of success in his business, is set to draft a new scheme for higher education. It might make more sense to put a philosopher or academic economist in charge of reforming business than the other way around. The recent reviews of higher education have seen it merely in terms of economic or private benefit terms, job prospects and pay. Lord Deering envisaged the purpose of universities as serving the local and national knowledge-based economy. On the first occasion that I ever met him in Oxford, while he was researching for his report, he asked me whether higher education had done anything to stop the growth of Nazism in Germany. Lord Brown's report seemed to assume that higher education exists to provide workers for business and science. His report, called Securing a Sustainable Future for Higher Education, in 2010. Students have come to be regarded as consumers, with consumer-type rights and contracts. Using business language, education is treated as something that can be delivered. But education is not a neat, complete package that needs only to be skillfully handed from one to another in order to ensure continuation and success. Education is a participatory and continuing process, the content of which is never fixed. No amount of good teaching can succeed without the intelligent participation, reception, and contribution of the student. And that is why some of it will always fail. When I was the independent adjudicator for higher education, charged with reviewing student complaints that had failed to be resolved by the universities, I tended to use this analogy. The government, and sometimes students, see universities as rather like package holidays. The brochure, here's one, beautiful girl, obviously having a good time. The brochure promises sun, sand, and sea. The reality may be a building site, bad food, and a motorway obstacle to reaching the beach. And if sufficiently disappointing, there can be legal action. But in reality, higher education is more like going to the gym. One has to go every day and make every effort until exhausted. And even then, there is no guarantee that one will become fit and lose weight. By adopting the business attitude, the levers of control were rationalised by 20th century governments and a grip taken on numbers and fees. I don't have the space here to go into the history of controls and funding, but note that Lord Robbins, in his 1963 report, envisaged the doubling of the university population from 7%, as it was then, to 15% in 1980, and saw that as coping with his target of finding places for all who should have them free. Lord Deering, in his report, Higher Education in the Learning Society, 1997, recommended fees. The report was cherry-picked by the Prime Minister, who imposed the recommended fee of £1,000 per annum in the Teaching and Higher Education Act 1998, but cut state funding to the university sector by the same amount and imposed a bursary requirement, as well as abolishing the student grant. In 2002, the government lifted the fee to £3,000 per annum, repayable once the graduate was earning over £15,000 per annum. None of these moves, not to mention the rigid requirements of the Higher Education Funding Council and the research assessment, elicited much protest from the universities. That protest didn't come, really, until the Brown Review, with the £9,000 tuition fee and the students taking to the streets. The biggest protest against the salami slicing of both support and freedom came in the feeble and self-wounding gesture of Oxford refusing an honorary degree for Mrs. Thatcher in 1985. Unit funding per student fell by 40% in the 1990s, while participation rose to over 40% of the youth cohort. The Education Reform Act 1988 took the polytechnics away from local authority control and turned them into universities, ending the binary system, where it had been understood that there were different missions for the two groups. There was little resistance to this at the time, because the purpose and identity of universities had become so confused as to render a defence based on ideology unacceptable. It was a quick fix for enlarging numbers in higher education. There are many controls over universities, and I will come to the social mobility issue a bit later. Despite the cull of quangos promised by the Public Bodies Act 2011, the university ones seem to have survived intact. I hope I've got this right. It takes several slides to list them. HEFCE, the Scottish Higher Education Funding Council, Higher Education Funding Council for Wales, Department for Employment and Learning, Northern Ireland, the Equality Challenge Unit, the Quality Assessment people, Teaching Quality Assessment, SLC, student loans, Unistats, Higher Education Statistics Agency, University and Colleges Employers Association, Research Assessment Exercise, now called Research Excellence Framework, P4P, that's Partnerships for Progression, National Consortium of University Entrepreneurs, the Graduate Talent Pool, the University and College Union, the Committee of University Chairs, Universities UK, Offer Fair Access, Office of the Independent Adjudicator, Higher Education Better Regulation Group, all flourish, and I probably omitted some. Indeed, the Brown Report promised a new super quango, amalgamating some of them. One of the worst controls was the research assessment exercise. The pressure it exerted on individual lecturers for quantity of publication was inimical to the good and extra teaching called for by the expansion of student numbers. Because the demand of research came so early in an academic career, combined with overcoming the probationary periods for beginners, in my experience, teaching colleagues would no longer go the extra mile as they once did, with the resultant adverse consequences for self-government of higher education institutions, which used to be achieved by the voluntary assumption of time-consuming administrative and pastoral offices for students. Lecturers are tempted to cut back on feedback and extra tuition in order to make time. The most recent research assessment exercise involved checking 200,000 pieces of work. And overall, in my view, the Higher Education Funding Council is micromanaging. In 2014, the research assessment exercise is to be replaced by the Research Excellence Framework. That will be based on metrics, that is, quantifying the elements regarded as important in an attempt to assess research objectively, not subjectively. There will be a weighting of impact of submitted research, counting for 20%, impact being the effect on the social, cultural, and economic world outside the academic community of origin. So much for laser research in the 1960s then. The assessment of research output will count for 65%. There will be a citation analysis, that is, how many times a particular piece of work has been cited by others. Plenty of scope for friendly arrangements between academics there. I cite you and you cite me. 15% will be awarded for the excellence of the research environment, which means, I suppose, the team. It remains to be seen whether this new scheme will be less inept than the one it replaces. Other controls developing are over entry standards, the right sort of students, fees and scholarships, the size of the student population, and the quality of teaching provision. The most recent tightening of the screws comes from the Business and Innovation Department white paper. Note, universities are under the Business Department. White paper, Students at the Heart of the System, June last year. A title worthy of debate in itself. Contrary to the other pronouncements about increasing participation by the socially disadvantaged, this paper proposes that universities should be allowed unrestrained recruitment of those students who achieve AAB or better at A level, estimated at some 65,000. Another 20,000 places will be allocated to universities charging lower fees, that is under 7,500 per annum. So the top universities will take in more top students, who are more likely to come from the independent schools, and the cheaper ones will get the less qualified ones. Since more higher grades are awarded in humanities than in the science and technology subjects, this will also tilt applications in top universities towards those taking non-science subjects. The top 10 universities that already have the highest proportion of students with AAB grades or better, and that includes Oxford and Cambridge at 99%, Imperial 96%, LSE 93%, UCL 82%, Bristol 85%, Exeter 74%, they are more or less the same universities with the lowest proportion of students from state schools. Oxford 54%, Durham and Cambridge 59%, Bristol 60%, Imperial 63% inter alia. This white paper also proposes loosening the rules to enable there to be more private degree awarding universities. So far, there is the BPP Business and Law Schools with pretty high fees, and the new College of the Humanities in London at £18,000 per annum. They may risk the stigma of being where you go if you cannot get a place elsewhere. Universities are also to be required to publish more data, including contact hours, student satisfaction surveys, employment and salaries after graduation, and actual A grades of admitted students. The white paper contains two meaningless or maybe sinister statements. I quote, "Putting financial power in the hands of learners makes student choice meaningful," unquote. I think this may mean that if students shop around, ready to pay high fees, universities will have to compete for their payments by offering more popular courses. Or it may mean that by taking out loans from the student loan company, the student can choose whether to study at a higher education institution or not. In the former case, universities do not, in fact, compete for students. Students compete for the best universities, and the competition is as fierce as when they were free. I've noted, and don't know the answer, why did the socially disadvantaged not apply to higher education in larger numbers when there were no tuition fees to pay at all, and grants were given to students for maintenance costs? I know there were fewer places, but the social balance of the applicants was as dire then as it is now, I think. Moreover, student choice can be quite dangerous. Before they reach the stage of applying, many courses may be closed to them because they've not taken the right A-levels. They may choose in a way that disadvantages them because they were not given the information in time to evaluate it. For example, the hours required of students in different disciplines can be tougher or less so. Medicine is top at 35.5 hours weekly median. Mass communication bottom at 19.4 hours. Yet many state-educated students may well opt for the latter. It ought to be the universities themselves that decide what and how to teach, and they should not have to pander to student passing fashions or preference for lighter workloads. The white paper also stated that universities, I quote, must take more responsibility for increasing social mobility, unquote. There are almost daily attacks on the alleged failure of universities to include sufficient numbers of the socially disadvantaged amongst their number, sometimes emphasizing their failure to attract applicants, at other times the failure of the applicants to secure admission. Although no allegations of direct discrimination have been made, this is implicit, however. Take, for example, the attack by Gordon Brown on Magdalen College in the year 2000 for not giving a place to read medicine to Laura Spence, who had perfect grades and came from a comprehensive school where she was the only Oxbridge candidate. At Magdalen that year, there were 5 places for 22 applicants for medicine. and those who secured places included state school educated students. In April 2011, David Cameron branded Oxford disgraceful because, as he put it, only one black person went there in the previous year. How much more attractive Oxford and Cambridge might appear to the timid applicant from a non-traditional background if our government made encouraging noises about competition rather than the inaccuracies and damaging assertions of those cases. In no other country would a leading politician attack top universities, especially when those politicians are themselves graduates of them. Oxford has spent many millions over the years on attracting students from all sorts of backgrounds to apply. The increased number inevitably brings disappointment to many more. The Prime Minister gave the impression that either Oxford discriminates against black candidates or that it's not doing enough to attract them, thereby undermining its reputation and sabotaging all the efforts made to increase recruitment. In fact, nothing gives lecturers more pleasure than discovering and nurturing talent in students from less privileged homes. After all, the academics want the brightest to share their own passion for their academic subjects, and the success of their students is their success too. The Prime Minister got his facts wrong. 19% of Oxford students are black and ethnic minority, whereas the percentage in the general population is about 14%. But I do not believe that there should be any concept such as overrepresentation or underrepresentation in considering the makeup of university students, any more than there should be in the Olympics or in the cabinet. And I believe universities are more akin to an Olympics of the mind than a driving test pass-fail situation. Is anyone going to complain next that there are too many students from one race or religion? The notion of quotas should be alien, for restrictions on the entry of certain groups to higher education is a hallmark of totalitarian regimes from the right and the left. My father told me that he was not allowed to graduate from Vienna University in the 1920s. In the interwar period, many of the Central European states imposed quotas based on the census for education and jobs. 1920 in Hungary, 1937 Poland. There was a German national law of 1933 against, I quote, overcrowding of German schools and universities, unquote, which limited them to 5% non-Aryan and was embraced by the university staff themselves. Of course, I'm not suggesting for a moment that we're getting like a Nazi regime. I'm simply pointing out that quotas in higher education have always been in bad situations and countries. Because in order to achieve the breaking of the old order when a new political regime is installed, it is vital to prevent the legacy of influence and the expectation of a good education being handed down in the generations. The Chinese knew this during the revolution when they stopped the children of the intelligentsia going to university, and so did the Eastern Europeans during the Cold War. Both sectors had in common the practice of preventing the children of the intelligentsia from following in their parents' footsteps. In Poland, after the war, the children of the intelligentsia were deliberately handicapped in university entry as a way of repressing their parents. The whole society was divided into peasants, workers, and intelligentsia. The children of peasants and workers got extra admissions points. The children of the intelligentsia had to score more highly. There was special higher education for communist dignitaries, which they called dishing out diplomas with no respect for educational standards, according to a study on this in December 2006. Shades of the treatment afforded by LSE to the son of Gaddafi recently. In my youth, certain selective schools and some colleges had quotas for Jews. My distaste, therefore, has deep roots. Moreover, this is the policy devised by the men and women whose background, private and grammar schools and Oxbridge, I highlighted at the start. What was good enough for them is not now going to be available, and the social mobility that was engendered by grammar schools and free universities will never return. Nor do we quite know what is meant by social mobility. It seems to mean that there should be equal chances of persons from different backgrounds by birth ending up in certain social or income brackets, or earning more than their parents. There are at least 3 further issues, difficult ones, with the notion of universities as a tool of social mobility. One is that the desired social preferment itself depends on a certain exclusivity. Once everyone is a graduate, it dissipates. And if everyone is going to be socially mobile into the otherwise despised middle class, there will still logically have to be some who are higher and some who are lower if everybody's moving up the ladder together. Universities used to, and are still thought, to confer individual mobility towards success and professional status, and to define artistic and professional success. There was a time when the universities and the rest of the country were in agreement on the definition of success. But now there is a rival elite group made of the rich, the celebrities, the trade union leaders, the media, the fashionable, and the influential. They may or may not be university educated, and their education in general has played little part in their success or the esteem in which they are held. The university elitism of the old sort was based on intellectual struggle and objective attainment, and it stands as a permanent reproach to the alternative celebrity elitism. If you don't believe me, have a look at the annual Sunday Times list of the 1,000 richest and see how far down the list you have to go before you come to one who is university educated and one whose education was determinant of their success. Although higher education does not often produce wealth in itself, we seem to be moving to a concept of higher education as an investment in future personal property, like taking out a mortgage in order to benefit from future property price rises. The second complex issue with social mobility is the age at which it starts. I've written and lectured elsewhere about the importance of the earliest years in securing the potential of a baby. By age 3, and certainly by age 5, many determinants of the child's potential are fixed, and they depend on not coming from a broken home, not being born in poverty to a single parent, and having parents who read to and nurture the child. 53% of 5-year-old boys are lagging behind in development when they start school, and 35% of girls. 1/3 leave primary school without adequate ability in the 3 Rs. By age 18, there may be little that can be done to awaken ambition where it has never existed. And if there is to be social mobility, it is a case for government interference in the earliest years and exhortation to build stable families, a topic that governments fear to address. Nevertheless, today's most controversial area of interference in the universities is the composition of the student body, university by university. In Newman's time, religious affiliation was the controversial criterion. More recently, it was gender, and now it's social class. First, there were exhortations to the universities from the Higher Education Funding Council to take a certain proportion of students from the maintained sector. When this was shown to be statistically illogical in terms of the numbers staying on into the sixth form, the Higher Education Funding Council moved to the postcode premium, more funds for universities which took students from SW2 but not SW3. If there's anyone here who doesn't know London, SW2 is Brixton, SW3 is Chelsea. You can play this game right through the London postcodes. More money probably for NW2 but not NW3, and so on. But then what if you happen to be the child of a nanny working in Hampstead? Anyway, then they switched tack and grants were made to spend on outreach work. And the imaginative and widespread efforts of the universities should be applauded. There have been endless initiatives, and often a change in government policy or funding has meant the end of one and the starting of another before there's time to see whether any of those outreach initiatives has been successful. But there is no way that some universities will ever change the standard of entry, nor do they need to, for virtually all the 3A grade applicants try for Oxford or Cambridge in any case. To recruit and encourage applications from all over the country is one thing, and a good thing. But to socially manipulate the entry for ideological or financial reasons should have no place in university thinking. In the end, everything comes down to family and school influences. There are too many school teachers who are anti-elitism, whatever that means, and discourage their students. And there are many students who do not want to go away from home, or whose families discourage them from aiming higher than their parents. The abolition of the maintenance grant, which enabled a student to live in a university far away from home, is arguably more damaging than anything else to social mobility, which depends, that is social mobility, on breaking away from local roots in many cases. And there are problems with the advice given in schools about applications and subjects to take at A-level and for which to apply. Universities are berated for the profile of their students, but there's no inquiry into the school failings. Independent schools produce 33% of the 3A candidates, although they educate 7% of the population only. 41% of state school 3A candidates apply to the oversubscribed professional university subjects of law, medicine, economics and management, maths, and English. Many state school applicants want to study subjects that some of the Russell League universities do not offer, such as mass communications, business, and veterinary science. They choose the wrong A-levels and sometimes the wrong subjects in terms of what is on offer from leading universities. Some recent legislation has not helped universities to distinguish one candidate for admission from another. The Data Protection Act has made all school references bland and unhelpful, for the candidate may see them, and the schools fear to give an honest, if unflattering portrait, as they did in the past, even though such a warts-and-all reference would actually be of assistance. Sheer numbers of applicants make it difficult to pick out the plagiarized personal statement, and the more anonymity is introduced into applications, and the fewer the interviews, the harder it is to find the applicants from disadvantaged backgrounds who have the ambition and talent to succeed. Access agreements, which universities enter into, typically focus on spending more resources on outreach work and scholarships, and requiring the publication of more data about targets and percentages already reached in relation to class and ethnic groups. Nevertheless, the latest regime requires all universities that plan to charge more than £6,000 per annum to reach an access agreement with the Office for Fair Access, known as OFFA, soon to be headed up by Professor Les Ebden. According to the OFFA guidelines of March 2011, the underrepresented groups who must be sought out are the lower socio-economic groups, the low income, that's below £42,000 per annum, some ethnic groups, persons in care, and the disabled. There are to be sanctions for serious and willful breach of the access agreement. What used to be penalised was failure to deliver measures, but now the emphasis has switched to outcomes, i.e., a requirement that the student body must reflect certain patterns. This, it seems to me, would not be legal, for OFFA also has the duty to protect admissions from external political interference under Section 32, subsection 2, subsection B of the Higher Education Act 2004, and any steps by them towards requiring a student makeup could be resisted by judicial review. Moreover, there is a human rights obligation under Article 14 of the European Convention on Human Rights, reflected in the Human Rights Act 1998, not to discriminate on grounds of social origin. I don't know how this squares with the obligation placed on public authorities by the Equality Act 2010 to have due regard to the reduction of socio-economic disadvantages in designing strategy. OFFA requires access agreements to relate to progress towards targets and milestones. It emphasises outcomes, but there is no legal obligation to change entrance requirements for certain groups. There is, however, a steer towards using contextual data, which might mean, as a result, relativity in entrance requirements according to background, subject, of course, to the restraints of the law cited above. If proportional outcomes are necessary in higher education, why not in health? Are hospitals to be required to treat patients according to social class, since we know that health outcomes and life expectancy are worse in the worse off? Ironically, the third pillar of a civilized society, apart from health and education, access to justice through legal aid, has been omitted from social mobility requirements by the government. The cuts proposed in legal aid, being debated today as I speak, without proper regard to their impact, will disadvantage the already disadvantaged disproportionately. The third complex issue with social mobility is that it stands to be damaged by the rise in tuition fees to £9,000. Although it's argued that this amount of debt should not be a deterrent, because the fees are not repayable until a certain income level is reached later in life. Nevertheless, the headline figures about the cost undoubtedly act as a deterrent to the very people whom it is sought to attract. Already, universities are anticipating a drop of about 1/5 in recruitment, and that the shortfall of the less advantaged will be made up by foreign students. Combined with cuts in funding, will all this damage the quality of our universities? The status of British universities has undoubtedly fallen. The question is, how far? Lord Baker said, I quote, "When great institutions decline, they do not suddenly fall over a precipice. They simply slide down the slope a little further each year in a genteel way, making do in their reduced circumstances, like a spinster in an Edwardian novel." Unquote. So, time for only a brief look at the controlling influence exercised by the setting of fees and the underfunding of universities. It's hard for the universities to complain. If they say they can't manage on the resources made available, they lose their reputations at once. So they manage, with the result that further cuts are then made because they seem to be able to cope with reduced income. But look at some of the external measures. From 1970 to 2010, 163 of the Nobel laureates in science worked in the United States, while 36 worked in the United Kingdom, and not all of them in universities. And the US has 50 times as many frequently cited scientific researchers as the UK. In 2010, the average salary of a university lecturer in the UK was £42,000 per annum, the very level below which the government says that people are socially disadvantaged and need to be pushed up by the universities. A few years ago, vice-chancellors were colossi bestriding the land. Annan, Beloff, Franks. With the exception of the former vice-chancellor here today, they are no longer household names. There is little scope for visionary leadership because the policies are laid down by government. And good managerial skills in a vice-chancellor are most important to implement and perhaps deflect of them and make the best of the situation. State spending on universities is dropping dramatically. Teaching in the humanities is no longer funded at all. So much for the purpose of a university. And the institutions will become increasingly reliant on the goodwill of alumni. Yet the alumni will themselves be paying off their loans and older ones financing their children's education for much longer. The loan system, which is destined to fail, since so many will never repay because they are on low salaries or out of the jurisdiction, will have two results. One is to indicate to women that government policy makes it sensible to find a rich husband while at college and never work, or take the lowest paying part-time jobs in order to avoid reaching the lower limit for repayment. The other solution is for universities to go private and for universities to reject state funding with its strings in its entirety. This may not be practicable for all sorts of reasons, including expensive research. If universities were free to charge, as they will, they could create a system whereby the fees paid by those who can would be sufficient to fund bursaries for those who can't, bearing in mind that the independent school parents are paying £30,000 a year or so before their children reach the university stage. Or a drastic pruning, returning the former polytechnics to the local authorities that once took responsibility for them, or confining state funding and full scholarships to a narrow range of universities taking the cleverest students. All the quangos that unnecessarily and restrictively assess universities should be abolished. The grant that HEFCE handles, currently roughly over 7 million, probably more than that, no, I don't know, anyway, could be used to fund a rolling endowment programme. Sorry, it's 7,361 million. Could be used to fund a rolling endowment programme with the aim of eventually endowing most universities and leaving them free to set their own fees and scholarships, as proposed by Sir Martin Jacob. This would take a very long time. It is the families of low ambition and the schools of low ambition that hold our young people back from aspiration, if at all, not higher education. One should support schemes such as run by Nottingham University that target primary school children. Universities should plan to go private and be left to set their own fees and bursaries. The way to treat offer is by resistance, to press for its abolition in the promised bonfire of the quangos, and to challenge any ruling about sanctions by way of judicial review based on current law and human rights. The cost of offer is about £500,000, and one can be reasonably confident that the universities would continue to do their outreach work without it, as they did before its establishment in 2004. Thank you, and I have a short period for questions.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, for your speech. I do apologise for arriving 10 minutes late. I only narrowly avoided it being metamorphosed into a pancake at Holborn Station. One of the things that there's not really anything I can disagree much with what you said. I'm sorry to disappoint you. But do you think a major cause of the problem that we now have with university goes back to I hesitate to use the word leadership because any academic worth his salt doesn't want a leader, but very, very poor management on the part of university vice-chancellors. It seems to me that a lot of the vice-chancellors over the last few years, I'm just an amateur observer of people at the top of our universities the last few years, instead of representing the universities and the government, have actually come back as the message boys from the government as to what's to be done. And I don't know whether you have any ideas as to whether anything can be done about this, or do you think that is not really an extremely important point?
I hesitate to criticise Vice-Chancellors because I've been close enough to them to see just how difficult it is. And of course, the Vice-Chancellors keep changing and the university initiatives keep changing. And I suppose all they can do, really, especially if their universities have meagre resources, and if they don't have successful alumni, is to make the best of the situation they are presented with. Though I have to say that as a united political force, one has not heard much. There may have been things going on behind the scenes that I never knew about and wasn't party to. But I've never really heard. I was expecting it in 1997 when Tony Blair came in and the Deering report had just been launched. And I thought, surely, you know, the Vice-Chancellors will march on Whitehall and Westminster. And I don't know what happened, but it didn't. If they did, it didn't have much effect. It's what I call salami slicing. I'm not saying that I would have done any better. I don't know. But you know, looking back on it, you can see that the great protests weren't made. There are parallels in what's happened with the professions. You know, they say that Baroness Thatcher launched into the medics, and now this government, or the previous government, is having a go at lawyers. You know, to what extent can you fight back? I don't know. I hesitate to condemn them in that way. I'm just saying it would take an enormous political force to counter that. And I'm hard-pressed to think of anything similar. I've been having statutory debates in the House of Lords recently. The combined force of the Lords and the lawyers has made little impact on legal aid. The combined force of the entire country has made very little impact on the health bill that's just gone through. very hard to see what you can do when a government is set on doing something and has a majority.
I could ask you 20 questions. You made such an interesting presentation this evening. But something I'd like your observations on. Some 20 years ago, a friend of mine was a lecturer at one of the constituent colleges of London University. He had a year sabbatical and went to the USA. He went, I would say, politically slightly pink. He came back thinking Margaret Thatcher was a loony lefty. And I asked him why. He said, well, the American students made me think, because after about 3 lectures, a couple of them came up and said, we don't think much of your lectures. My father's paying a lot of money for my fees here. If you don't improve, we'll make trouble for you. Now, I've never heard of that in this country. And with the massive expansion of universities, have we got university lecturers and teachers of an adequate quality? Now, the slightly different veer on this eligibility for university, another former colleague of mine became assistant vice-chancellor of one of the South African universities, where after, in the post-apartheid era, they had to have positive discrimination. And I asked him how he, linked this to what he'd always discussed before. I said, look, under these situations, these people have not had the training at school. They will stay forever as an underclass unless we make positive discrimination. And that was a white Afrikaner.
Well, you've raised some enormous issues. On the quality of our teachers, I'm sure that they are just as good as their American counterparts. I know that the process of feedback and sort of acting to an audience is much more widespread in North America, and I've taught there myself, and the students expect you to perform. It's not quite true to say I'm paying for it, because they have lots of bursaries there. And for many American universities, they take you and then they'll find a financial package to help you if you can't afford it. But there is also feedback here. It came rather later, but I think most universities do now have feedback on the professors. I mean, I know Oxford started a long time ago, and if Oxford did, I'm sure all the others did. There's even a website called ratemyprofessor.com where you can write down what you think about your professor. You have to be balanced about that, because it would be dangerous to expect a professor or a teacher always to be popular and to play to the audience. On the other hand, you want them to be a good teacher, so you've got to get a balance of that and not just play to your audience. I did feel that pressure when I was in North America. They wanted an entertaining experience for an hour. On South Africa, I did teach there very briefly at Cape Town University Law School, very briefly. And the quality of the students was fantastic. It was a mixed class, every colour in the rainbow, and they were absolutely wonderful. I doubt very much whether they need much positive discrimination. I think if they need help, it's probably at a lower level. I think probably getting people to stay at school through primary and on up to age 18 is probably more of a problem in South Africa than the actual university education. But even accepting that South Africa had to change, you've got to do 2 things. As I said at the beginning, each university generation has not got to be only educated, but they've got to climb on the shoulders of their predecessors. You have to go further. It's not enough just to learn what your parents learned. You've got to take it one stage further, which means that not everybody, and in fact most of them, shouldn't have to discriminate, because how are we going to get those new medicines, developments in the computers, all the rest of it, unless people go further than the level that their parents reached? It's not enough just to get educated. You've got to go beyond. And some universities have got to have that mission. The American universities certainly do. Someone at the back.
Thank you very much for your talk. It seems fairer to me to allow contextual data and widening participation than the alternative, where you allow parents to buy advantage for their children with private tutoring and private schools, given that's at the cost of the others who don't have those advantages.
I think universities do use some contextual information, if by that you mean looking at what sort of school it is and what record they have. And I think university teachers will take into account the fact that a bright student has come from a school with a rather poor success rate. I mean, I certainly did that, and I still remember some great successes that I had. On the other hand, I think there's no getting away from the fact that for many courses you need 3 A's at A-level, and there are plenty of people who get 3 A's at A-level, and you shouldn't have to say to certain people, oh, you can come with 3 B's or 3 C's or whatever. You also have to remember the dangers of dropout. Some universities that have made a great effort to do outreach have very high dropout rates, and that's a shame. And other universities don't, and I think that's a field well worth studying. It's no good taking someone onto a course where they can't hack it and where the lecturers don't have the time or the resources to nurture students through. And I think the real advantage, and again, it's a bit of a vicious circle, is those universities that can afford to give students individual tuition, where the door of the tutor is open and you can go in for that extra hour, that extra bit of help. Not where it's a huge class and no one knows who you are and you can't get any extra help. I think that lies in the way forward, hanging on to people, mentoring them, getting them through.
Hello. You mentioned the white paper. What we're not having, we're told now, is a bill and then an act of Parliament to implement the things that were proposed in that white paper. Are peers such as yourself who've been very active in higher education policy concerned about the fact that changes might be done without legislation? How can we keep an eye to make sure?
Which bit of the white paper is not happening?
Well, I mean,
the redistribution of students.
Well, I mean, student numbers is happening anyway, but things to do with forms of regulation. I mean, they're talking about having no bill at all, so various things to do with degree awarding powers, those sorts of things, all being put through either piecemeal as part of other legislation.
Well, that's a shame. I obviously would prefer an open debate on that, though I'm by no means sure that you would get the result that you want, if I can guess what you want, because the strength of the government plus coalition is such, as I've learned to my cost, that on the whole they get what they want, whichever way it's done. And increasingly, there doesn't seem that much difference between one government and another in what they do with universities. Each one of them adds on tuition fees. Each one of them makes noises about social mobility and tries to rearrange the distribution of students. But I obviously would prefer it to be done in an open way rather than just by passing a statutory instrument or whatever, or just by leaning on people in a sort of behind-the-scenes way.
Education's not my subject, but I will say I believe in meritocracies, but they seem to be a bit thin on the ground at the moment. But anyway, I was talking about the government today, for instance, and I've heard and read that David Cameron's cabinet is 2/3 old Etonians or Rovians. So if you're a lady now starting out in politics, you've only got 1/3 of a chance to get into the real power even before you start. And that brings on another point that you touched upon, and that is grammar schools.
Is what?
Grammar schools,
Yes.
because seeing as though we've lost grammar schools, people from other levels in life, say the trade for want of a better word, are not seeing it's the privately educated elite that are making it to the top positions, and not people that went to grammar schools. And I know grammar schools are an anathema to some people in society. I think we should have some form of higher education at the grassroots.
Yes. Well, with the grammar schools, that's a very difficult issue. And of course, some of the schools that were grammar have now become independent. So if you count up statistics today, you don't get a true picture. And I think it is an unfortunate coincidence, or whatever it is, that such a large portion of the cabinet are Etonians. To which I say, I think it would be better if all schools imitated whatever it is that Eton does to its students, rather than just saying, oh, there shouldn't be so many Etonians in the cabinet. If what Eton does to its students is give them confidence, or train them in public speaking, or make them believe they can do anything under the sun, then maybe other schools should do it too. I don't know. There are some people at Eton who probably aren't very clever, but leave with confidence. But I agree with you about the cabinet. It does not look good. On the other hand, there's never been anyone saying the cabinet has got to represent, let's say, black and ethnic minorities, a percent of this, a percent of the other. We clearly want a bigger spread, and I think MPs do cover a bigger spread than they used to. The House of Lords is about 25% women. I'm not sure how many black and ethnic minorities, but certainly more than they've got in the House of Commons. And if I can put in a plug, if we have an elected House of Lords, which is on the books, there will be, I assure you, far fewer women, far fewer disabled, far fewer black and ethnic minority. But with things like the cabinet or the Olympics, you know, do you want the person who is demonstrably the most talented in this field to represent you? Or, if it's different, do you want to ensure quotas of this and quotas of that? And on the whole, I'd rather have the most talented. All right, I'll be back in a fortnight on universities again. Thank you.
For all information, please visit www.gresham.ac.uk.